The history of mankind is an epic of great rivalries, and perhaps none has shaped the Western world as profoundly as the epic battle between Rome and Carthage. This was not simply a war of territory. It was a clash of two worlds, two philosophies, two destinies. On one side was the Roman Republic, a young wolf that had just devoured the Italian peninsula, with its heart of peasant, soldier legions, its iron discipline, and its burning desire to reach the world. On the other was the Carthaginian Empire, an ancient trading giant, a shark that ruled the seas with its mighty fleets and the wealth that flowed from its colonies. In 264 BC, the Mediterranean seemed too small for either of them. They were poles apart. Rome was a land power, a force of heavy infantry, of iron determination and ruthlessness. Carthage was a sea power, of wealth, of trade networks and professional mercenaries bought with gold. They had been allies, had signed treaties respecting each other's spheres of influence. So what drove these two giants into a devastating war that lasted nearly a quarter of a century, claimed hundreds of thousands of lives, and forever changed the map of world power? The answer lay not in the halls of the Senate or the ornate palaces of Carthage. It lay on a rich, volatile island called Sicily, and it was sparked by a group of people both empires despised, a band of mercenaries. Sicily, in the mid-3rd century BC, was a powder keg waiting to explode. It was the crossroads of the Mediterranean, a breadbasket that any empire would covet, and a complex geopolitical chessboard. To the west of the island lay the domain of Carthage, with its fortified port cities such as Lilybaeum and Panormus. To the southeast lay the Greek world, with the mighty city of Syracuse at its heart. Between them were countless native tribes and opportunists who were always ready to change sides. For centuries, Sicily had been the stage for the endless wars between Carthage and the Greek city-states, a tug of war that would never end. Both were accustomed to this deadly dance, but they did not know that a third dancer, clumsy but powerful, was about to enter the stage. The fire was lit from the ashes of a tyrant. Agethocles, the tyrannical ruler of Syracuse, died in 289 BC during his reign. He had hired a large army of mercenaries from Campania, a region in Italy recently conquered by Rome. They were experienced, ruthless warriors with no homeland to return to. When Agethocles died, the new government of Syracuse no longer needed them and had no money to pay them. Dismissed and facing an uncertain future, these Campanian soldiers did not choose to go quietly. They decided to create their own kingdom. Their target was Messana, a prosperous Greek city located right on the narrow strait separating Sicily from mainland Italy. Its strategic position was undeniable. Whoever controlled Messana had the key to getting in and out of Sicily. In 288 BC, they entered the city under cover of darkness, pretending to be friends, and then struck. A terrible massacre ensued. All the men in the city were killed. The women and property were divided among themselves. They seized houses and land and gave themselves a proud new name, Mamertines, children of Mars, the Roman god of war. For nearly 2 decades, these children of war had turned Messana into a den of plunder, spreading terror throughout northeastern Sicily. They lived like a cancer on the island until a talented surgeon appeared. His name was Hieron, a military commander who had risen to become the new ruler of Syracuse. Determined to restore his city to its former glory, Hieron raised a powerful citizen army and declared war on the bandits. In 265 BC, at the Battle of the Longinus River, Hieron's army crushed the Mamertines. The panicked survivors fled to the citadel of Messana, surrounded by the mighty Syracuse army. The arrogance of the children of the war god had evaporated, replaced by the fear of total annihilation. They knew they could not save themselves. They needed a patron, a force strong enough to confront Syracuse. But who? In desperation, a heated debate raged within the walls of Messana. One faction argued that Carthage should be called upon for help. They were the region's most powerful naval power, had a base in Sicily, and certainly did not want to see Syracuse become too powerful. The other faction, presumably of Italian origin, turned to Rome. Rome had just conquered the entire peninsula, its land power was unquestioned, and they were fellow countrymen. Unable to agree, the mercenaries took the risk of sending out appeals to both sides. They rolled 2 dice at the same time, hoping for luck. The call for help from Carthage was answered almost immediately. For them, this was a golden opportunity. A small fleet under an admiral named Hanno quickly arrived at the port of Messana, and a Carthaginian garrison entered the city to protect the Mamertines from Hiron. In fact, Carthage swallowed its prey. Hiron, unwilling to confront Carthage head-on, reluctantly withdrew his troops. Meanwhile, in Rome, the Mamertines' appeal had caused a political crisis. The Senate was deeply divided. The conservative faction, led by the old families, was vehemently opposed. Their arguments were compelling. First, Rome had a treaty with Carthage, and intervention in Sicily would be a flagrant act of war. Second, and more morally important, only a few years earlier, Rome had brutally punished another band of Campanian mercenaries for doing exactly the same thing, capturing the Greek city of Rhegium. How could they punish one band of raiders and then protect another for strategic reasons? It would make Rome look hypocritical on the international stage. Finally, and most terrifying, was the Carthaginian fleet. Rome's navy was now a laughingstock, barely capable of patrolling the coast. To challenge the supremacy of the seas was suicidal. But the warmongers, perhaps spurred on by the ambitious Claudius, saw a different picture. They did not see bandits, they saw a strategic pawn. If Carthage controlled Messana, it would have a perfect bridgehead into Italy at will. Sicily, with its endless wheat supply, would be completely at the mercy of potential enemies. Fear and greed were a potent mix. They believed that the danger of Carthage controlling the straits was greater than the danger of war. The debate dragged on and on. The Senate, unable to reach a decision, did something very Roman. It pushed the responsibility onto the people. The matter was brought before the Centuriate Council. Here, complex arguments about honor and treaty gave way to simpler, more enticing promises: glory for Rome and booty for every soldier. For a people who had just spent decades at war to conquer Italy, a promising new expedition was an invitation too good to refuse. The decision was made. Rome would invade Sicily. The consul Appius Claudius Caudex was given the task. Crossing the straits under cover of darkness with a fleet of pinso, he was confronted with a harsh reality: the Carthaginians were there. But Claudius was typical Roman: bold, cunning, and unscrupulous. He invited the Carthaginian admiral Hanno to a peace conference. Hanno, perhaps overconfident in his own strength, agreed. It was a fatal mistake. As soon as Hanno entered the Roman camp, he was captured. Claudius gave him a simple ultimatum. Either Hanno ordered the Carthaginian garrison to withdraw from the citadel of Messana, or he would be executed. Forced into a corner, Hanno obeyed. The Mamertines, seeing the turn of events, immediately opened the gates to the Roman legions. In the blink of an eye, Rome had replaced Carthage as master of Messana. The news that reached Carthage caused a furor. They not only executed poor Hanno for his cowardice, but also immediately took action. A new army was sent, and Carthage did the unthinkable: they allied with their old enemy, Hiron of Syracuse. Together, they laid siege to Messana, determined to destroy both the Romans and the traitorous Mamertines. The First Punic War had officially begun. Rome proved its power immediately. Claudius's legions marched out of the city, routing both the Syracuse and the Carthaginians in 2 separate battles. The sheer power of the Roman heavy infantry gave Hiron pause. He realized he had bet on the wrong horse. A new, stronger, and more ferocious giant had emerged. In 263 BC, Hiron signed a peace treaty with Rome, becoming its staunchest ally throughout the war. He provided food, money, and stability to the Roman rear in Sicily. This was a crucial diplomatic turning point. With Syracuse's backing, Rome began a systematic campaign to conquer the island. Their next major target was Agrigentum Acragas in Greek, a powerful and wealthy city on the southern coast, and Carthage's main base of operations in Sicily. In 262 BC, an army of 4 Roman legions, some 40,000 men, laid siege to the city. It was the first major battle of the war, a real test for both sides. The siege of Agrigentum was a classic display of Roman military engineering. They built an elaborate system of fortifications around the city, with one ring to prevent the garrison inside from storming, and another to protect them from any relief army from the outside. The Carthaginian general inside the city, Hannibal Gisco, put up a valiant defense, but after 5 months of siege, supplies began to run low. Carthage sent a large relief force led by another general named Hanno, with skilled Numidian cavalry and, most terrifyingly, 50 war elephants. Hanno cleverly captured the Roman supply base at Urbessus, dramatically turning the tide. Now the besiegers became the besieged. The Romans were trapped between Agrigentum and Hanno's army, cut off from food supplies. Famine and disease began to ravage their ranks. In their desperation, the Roman consuls knew they had only one choice: break through or die. They rallied their forces and faced Hanno in a fierce battle. The Carthaginian Numidian cavalry easily routed the weak Roman cavalry. But when it came to the infantry, it was a different story. The Roman manipulous troops, with their superior discipline and strength, charged straight into the Carthaginian formation. The battle descended into chaos as the Carthaginian war elephants, perhaps wounded or panicked, turned on their own troops. Hanno's ranks broke. He was forced to retreat in disarray. That night, taking advantage of the Romans' distraction after their victory, Hannibal Gisco and his garrison made a spectacular escape from Agrigentum. The next morning, the Romans entered a nearly empty city. Their fury was terrible. Agrigentum had been savagely sacked, and its 25,000 inhabitants had been sold into slavery. The victory at Agrigentum was a resounding victory. On land, the Roman legions were unrivaled. Most of Sicily's cities rushed to the victorious side. Rome seemed on the verge of complete conquest of the island. But there was a problem, a very big problem. Every time their legions reached the coast, they could only watch helplessly as the Carthaginian quintets sailed through the waves. The Carthaginian fleet was still intact. They could raid the Italian coast at any time. They could resupply their remaining strongholds in western Sicily, and they could block any invasion of their African homeland. Rome controlled the island's mainland, but Carthage was still master of the seas surrounding it. The Roman senators were faced with an inevitable truth. This war could not be won with swords and shields alone. To defeat Carthage, they could not be just wolves. They had to become sharks. The Roman eagle, whether it liked it or not, would have to learn to rule the waves. The greatest and most expensive arms race in antiquity was about to begin. The victory at Agrigentum was a powerful statement, but also a harsh reality for Rome. Their legions, unstoppable land war machines, swept across much of Sicily like a firestorm. But the storm always stopped short of reaching the coast. There, Rome's power ended, and Carthage's began. The Carthaginian fleets sailed over the waves like vengeful ghosts, controlling the sea lanes, supplying their coastal strongholds like Lilybaeum and Panormus, and even making daring raids on the Italian coast itself, spreading humiliation and fear. For the Roman senators, the situation was unacceptable. They were like a boxer who can punch hard, but cannot touch an opponent who dances just out of reach. The war in Sicily had descended into a strategic stalemate. Rome could win every land battle, but it could not end the war. Carthage could lose on land, but it could not be completely defeated as long as it was king of the sea. Every victory of the legions on the island could be undone by a Carthaginian landing somewhere else. Rome was bleeding slowly, in men and treasure, in a war of attrition in which the ruler of the sea always had the last advantage. A revolutionary, almost insane, decision was made in the conference rooms of the Curia Hostilia. It went against centuries of Roman tradition, a people of the land, of farmers and foot soldiers. The decision was Rome must have a fleet, not the rickety coast guard they had, but a real fighting fleet, one that could take on the great warships of Carthage head-on. Rome decided that if they could not defeat the shark on land, they would chase it into the depths of the sea. The Roman eagle would have to learn to swim. It was a nearly impossible task. The challenge was not just shipbuilding, but a complete revolution in technology, logistics, and manpower. The standard naval weapon of the era was the 5-row galley, or quinquereme. This was no ordinary ship, it was the most complex war machine, the battleship of the ancient world. Larger, heavier, and far more robust than the triremes of classical Greece, a quinquereme was a floating fortress capable of carrying 120 marines and a crew of nearly 300 rowers. Its power lay in its reinforced bronze bow, designed to ram and break the sides of enemy ships in a single strike. And herein lies the crux of the matter. Carthage had been perfecting the art of building and using quinqueremes for generations. Their crews were experts, able to perform complex maneuvers like the Dick Plus, breaking through enemy lines and then turning to attack from behind, or the Periplus circling around and attacking the stern. Naval warfare of that era was a dance of death that required perfect coordination and decades of experience. The Roman crew. They were peasants and craftsmen who had never seen a real naval battle in their lives. Handing them a quinquereme was like handing a child the keys to a Formula One race car. But before they could worry about sailing, they had to build one, and they didn't even have blueprints. Carthage kept its shipbuilding techniques a state secret. Then fate, or perhaps Neptune, smiled on Rome. A Carthaginian quinquereme, while pursuing a Roman ship, ran aground awkwardly on the coast of Italy. The Carthaginians abandoned their ship, and the Romans got what they wanted, a perfect specimen. What happened next was a testament to Roman engineering and organizational genius. The wreck was dismantled piece by piece, meticulously studied and copied. The forests of Italy rang with the sound of axes and saws. An emergency shipbuilding program of unprecedented scale was launched. In a short 60 days, according to the historian Polybius, a miracle had been accomplished. From scratch, Rome and its Italian allies had built a fleet of 100 quinqueremes and 20 triremes. It was a colossal mobilization of industry, a national effort. But building the ships was only half the problem. Training 30,000 oarsmen from scratch was an even greater challenge. And here the Romans showed their strangely practical ingenuity. While the ships were still being built on slipways, on beaches across Italy, huge wooden scaffolds were erected, exact replicas of the oar benches inside a quinquereme. Thousands of recruits who might have spent their entire lives working under a plow sat on these scaffolds, day in and day out, practicing rowing in the air. They learned to listen and follow the rhythm of the killicets, to row in unison as one body. It was a strange sight, but it worked. When the first ships were launched, Rome had crews who, however raw, at least knew what to do. The Roman leadership, however, had no illusions. They knew that even with 6 months or 6 years of training, their crews would never be able to match the Carthaginians, who were well versed in the art of ramming ships. Trying to play by the Carthaginian rules would be suicide. And if you can't win a game, what does a Roman do? They change the rules. Roman engineers went back to the drawing board, and they came up with a weapon that would become legendary, a solution that was both genius and brutal, something that was utterly Roman. It was called the corvus, which means the crow in Latin. The Corvus was essentially a narrow assault bridge, about 11 meters long, attached to a mast at the front of the ship. At the other end of the bridge was a heavy, pointed metal beak, like a crow's beak. The bridge could be raised and lowered using a system of pulleys. The idea behind it was as simple as it was brutal. As a Carthaginian ship closed in for its signature ram, the Romans would make no attempt to dodge. They would take the brunt of the impact, and in that instant they would drop Corvus. The heavy iron beak would sink into the enemy's deck, locking the two ships together. In an instant, the naval battle was over, and the land war began. The legionnaires, masters of hand-to-hand combat, would roar across the bridge, turning the Carthaginian ship into a slaughterhouse. The Corvus was an admission of defeat in seamanship, but also a statement of confidence in the core of Roman strength. The message was clear. We cannot fight you at sea with our wits, so we will turn the sea into land and fight you with our brawn. However, the weapon also had a fatal flaw. Its forward mass made ships unstable and top-heavy, especially in bad weather. It was a small detail, but it would become a terrifying omen for the future. In 260 BC, Rome's new fleet, armed with secret weapons, was ready to set sail. Its first mission ended in disaster and humiliation. The consul Gnaeus Cornelius Scipio, commanding an advance squadron of 17 ships, was overzealous when he heard that the Lipari Islands could be easily captured. He sent his fleet into the harbor without careful reconnaissance. A Carthaginian fleet, commanded by Bodus, quietly surrounded the harbor at night. When day broke, Scipio found himself completely trapped. His inexperienced crew panicked and fled ashore. Scipio, helpless, surrendered without a fight. He went down in history as Scipio Asina, Scipio the Fool. It was an embarrassing start. All the burden and all the hope now fell on the remaining consul, Gaius Duilius. He was a novus homo, new man, not descended from an old aristocratic family, but he possessed the caution and determination that his counterpart lacked. Duilius led the remainder of the fleet, about 100 ships, in search of the Carthaginian fleet. They met off the northern coast of Sicily, near a place called Mylae. The Carthaginian general commanding this battle was Hannibal Gisco, the same general who had escaped from Agrigentum. He commanded a fleet of 130 ships, and when he saw the clumsy-looking Roman ships, he was disdainful. He did not even bother to form a battle line. Seeing this as an easy hunt, 30 of Carthage's fastest warships charged forward, determined to end the battle quickly. They charged straight into the Roman line, ready to execute the perfect thrust. Then, something strange happened. The massive bridges fell from nowhere, accompanied by a dull thud as iron beaks sank into the wood. Before the Carthaginian sailors knew what was happening, the bronze-clad soldiers, with their huge scutum shields and deadly short gladius swords, roared and swarmed over. The battle had turned into a melee. The Carthaginians' seamanship had been rendered useless. They were slaughtered on their own decks. The Carthaginian ships following behind, horrified by the sight, tried to change tactics. They tried to attack the side or stern of the Roman ships to avoid Corvus. But they were met with another surprise. Corvus was mounted on a swivel. The death bridges could rotate and lower in almost any direction. Any Carthaginian ship that got too close was seized by the crow. Panic gripped the Carthaginian fleet. After losing an unimaginable 50 ships, Hannibal Gisco ordered a retreat. What remained of the once invincible fleet fled in disgrace. The victory at Mylae sent shockwaves throughout the Mediterranean. It was more than a victory. It was a reversal of the world order. The apprentice had defeated the master. The wolf had grown shark fins and teeth. Gaius Duilius returned to Rome a hero. He was given a triumphal procession, the first in Roman history to honor a naval victory. A triumphal column, the Columna Rostrata, was erected in the Roman Forum, decorated with the bronze prows of captured Carthaginian warships. The victory at Mylae changed the course of the war. Rome was no longer on the defensive at sea. It was on the offensive. In the following years, it expanded the war beyond Sicily, attacking Carthaginian colonies in Sardinia and Corsica. The war was no longer a regional conflict over an island. It had become a full-scale war for control of the Western Mediterranean. The Roman eagle had learned more than just how to swim. It had learned how to hunt in enemy territory. With this new confidence, Rome's leaders began to contemplate a bolder move, a gamble that could end the war once and for all. The question in the Senate meetings was no longer, how do we push Carthage out of Sicily? But how do we strike at the very heart of Carthage? The African gamble was about to begin. The victory at Mylae did more than give Rome a glittering triumphal column in the Roman Forum. It injected a sweet poison into the veins of the Republic: arrogance. The fear of the Carthaginian navy that had haunted the minds of the senators for generations had vanished. In its place was an unshakable faith in Rome's fortuna, a belief that there was no challenge that the Roman will could not overcome. Their legionaries had proved their dominance on land. Now their peasant sailors, aided by a stroke of genius, had brought down the masters of the sea. The logic of war, in the eyes of the warlike minds of Rome, had become clear and inevitable. Why continue the costly war of attrition in Sicily, taking one city at a time when they could strike a fatal blow at the heart of the enemy? The idea of an invasion of North Africa, Carthage's homeland, began to take shape and quickly became an unquenchable flame of ambition. It was a huge gamble, a classic Roman all-or-nothing strategy. It would require a mobilization of resources unprecedented in history. But the rewards were worth it. A decisive victory would end the war, bring ultimate glory to the commanders, and enough booty to enrich a generation. For the consuls of 256 BC, Marcus Atilius Regulus and Lucius Manlius Vulso, it was a chance to carve their names into history forever. Preparations were on a terrifying scale. Both superpowers were focused on the coming confrontation. The hammers and saws rang out in the shipyards of Rome and its Italian allies. Rome had assembled a massive fleet of 330 warships, mostly proven quinqueremes. Each ship carried not only a crew of 300, but also 120 battle-hardened Marines. In total, Rome's force numbered nearly 140,000 men, a staggering number. This was more than just a fleet. It was a floating city, a vast invasion force ready to set sail. But Carthage did not sit idly by. Its intelligence network had warned of the impending threat. Faced with its homeland being invaded for the first time in centuries, Carthage responded with an equally formidable effort. It assembled an even larger fleet, with 350 warships and some 150,000 men. Its goal was clear: to stop the Roman invasion fleet at sea, drowning its enemy's ambitions at the bottom of the Mediterranean before it ever reached the shores of Africa. These two massive fleets met off the southern coast of Sicily near a place called Cape Ecnomus. What followed was more than just a naval battle. It was the largest naval battle in the history of the ancient world, and perhaps the largest naval battle in human history to this day. Nearly 700 warships and 300,000 men were about to decide the fate of empires in a single day. The Roman commanders Regulus and Manlius knew that their ships were slower and more difficult to maneuver than the Carthaginians. Their first priority was to protect the vulnerable transport ships carrying horses and equipment. So they arranged their fleet in an ingenious wedge formation. Two vanguard squadrons formed two sides of a triangle, with the flagships of the two consuls leading the way. A third squadron formed the base of the triangle, towing the transport ships. And a fourth squadron, called triarii, after the last rank of troops in a legion, formed a horizontal line behind to protect the rear. The Carthaginians, under the command of Hamilcars, another Hamilcar, not Barkov and Hanno, had drawn up their fleet in a long line, intending to carry out a classic encirclement. Their right wing, commanded by Hanno, stretched out to sea, ready for an outflanking. The battle began. The two Roman vanguards charged straight into the center of the Carthaginian fleet. Hamilcar, as planned, ordered his center to feign retreat. The Romans, fired up, gave furious pursuit. The trap was half sprung. The Roman wedge was stretched and broken. The rear squadrons and transports were now left alone and vulnerable. Immediately, both wings of the Carthaginian fleet swung into action. Hanno's wing circled offshore, attacking the Roman triarii. The other wing closed inland, attacking the third squadron protecting the transports. The battle had now split into three separate, fierce engagements on a front stretching for miles. In the center, having lured the Romans far enough away, Hamilcar gave the signal, and the Carthaginians suddenly turned and charged. A fierce melee broke out. The Carthaginians, with superior skill, circled the Roman ships, attempting to ram the sides. But that was where Corvus came in. Time and again, the iron ravens were dropped, locking the ships together. The Roman legionaries poured through, and the Carthaginian seamanship was useless against the sheer force of the Roman infantry. Gradually, the Carthaginian center collapsed. Hamilcar was forced to order a retreat. With the center won, the two consuls split up. Manlius stayed behind to mop up the battlefield, while Regulus led his squadron back to rescue the rest of the fleet. He charged into the Battle of the Triarii, attacking the rear of Hanno's formation. Caught between the two pincers, Hanno fought his way free and fled. Finally, Regulus and Manlius joined forces to attack the last Carthaginian squadron, which was forcing the Roman third squadron ashore. Surrounded on three sides, the squadron was all but destroyed. The Battle of Ecnomus was a complete but extremely bloody victory for the Romans. They sank 30 Carthaginian ships and captured 64 others, while losing only 24. The route to Africa was open. The Roman fleet landed on the Cape Bon Peninsula, a rich and fertile area just off Carthage. The shock to the Carthaginians was indescribable. Their homeland, safe behind its sea walls for centuries, was now violated. Regulus's legions began a systematic campaign of destruction. They were not just looking for food, they were waging economic war. Farms, villas, and villages were burned. Livestock were herded away. And most horrifying of all, 20,000 local people were captured and sold into slavery. The goal was to spread terror, cripple Carthage's agriculture, and incite their allies to revolt. In the midst of the campaign, a strange order came from Rome. The Senate, perhaps thinking that the hardest part was over, or perhaps due to internal political infighting, ordered Consul Manlius to return to Rome with the bulk of the fleet and the spoils. Regulus was ordered to stay behind to finish the job, but with a greatly reduced force of 15,000 infantry, 500 cavalry, and 40 ships. It was an arrogant and short-sighted decision, one that would prove costly. At first, however, things seemed to be going well. Regulus, with a smaller force, pressed on and laid siege to the city of Hades. The Carthaginian army, commanded by a trio of incompetent generals, attempted to relieve the siege. But they made a fundamental tactical mistake. They were stationed on a hill, a terrain that completely negated their two most powerful weapons, cavalry and war elephants. Regulus did not miss the opportunity. He attacked from two sides at dawn, routing the Carthaginian army. The victory at Hades had made Regulus overconfident. He believed that Carthage's will to fight had been broken. Carthage, in a panic, sent envoys to negotiate. This was an opportunity to end the war with a favorable treaty for Rome. But Regulus did not want a favorable treaty. He wanted a humiliating surrender. The terms he offered were not those of a diplomat, but those of a brutal conqueror. Carthage would have to give up Sicily and Sardinia, disband almost its entire navy, pay a huge war indemnity, and essentially become a vassal state of Rome. To the Carthaginian Senate, these terms were worse than war. The pride of a great empire had been insulted. Better to fight to the last man than to accept such a humiliating existence. They refused. Regulus's arrogance had robbed him of his own chance at peace. In Carthage's darkest hour, an unexpected ray of hope came. A recruiting ship had just returned from Greece, bringing a fresh group of mercenaries. Among them was a Spartan named Xanthippus. He was more than just a soldier. He was a product of the most brutal and efficient military system in the ancient world. Upon hearing of Carthage's repeated defeats, Xanthippus openly criticized their generals. He said that it was not the Carthaginian soldiers who were weak, but their commanders who were foolish. They had superior cavalry and war elephants, but they were constantly fighting on hills and rough terrain. His words reached the Carthaginian leaders. In desperation, they summoned this Spartan mercenary. Xanthippus presented his plan clearly and logically. Take the battle to the plains. Let the cavalry and war elephants do their work. Trust in your own strength. His words rekindled the flame of hope. An unprecedented decision was made. The entire command of the Carthaginian army was given to a foreign mercenary. Xanthippus set to work immediately. He gathered the remnants of his army, trained them in Spartan discipline, and taught them how to coordinate infantry, cavalry, and war elephants. He transformed the rabble into a well-coordinated war machine. When he was ready, he led his army, 12,000 infantry, 4,000 cavalry, and nearly 100 war elephants, out of Carthage and straight toward Regulus, camp on a vast plain near the Bagradus River. Regulus, seeing that his enemy finally dared to face him on level ground, confidently accepted the challenge. He probably still believed that his legions were invincible, regardless of the terrain. He had arranged his army in a deeper formation than usual, hoping to withstand the charge of the elephants. It was a fatal miscalculation. The battle began. Xanthippus placed all 100 of his elephants in a long column at the front. When he gave the order to charge, the giant living wall charged toward the Romans. At the same time, the 4,000 Carthaginian and Numidian cavalry on either flank began to move. The Roman cavalry, only 500 strong, was wiped out from the battlefield in a matter of minutes. Meanwhile, in the center, the Roman legions faced the fury of the elephants. Their ranks were torn apart, soldiers were trampled, thrown into the air. Chaos reigned. While the Roman center was being crushed, the Carthaginian cavalry, having destroyed the enemy cavalry, turned back and attacked the flanks and rear of the Roman infantry. The legions were now completely surrounded, attacked from the front by the Carthaginian elephants and phalanxes, and decimated from the rear and sides by cavalry. It was a massacre, a perfect display of combined arms tactics. Of Regulus, 15,500 men, 13,000 were killed. Only 2,000 on the left wing, who had avoided the elephants, broke through and escaped, and the consul Marcus Atilius Regulus himself, who had arrogantly refused peace, was captured. The African gamble had ended in total disaster. News of the destruction of Regulus's army sent shockwaves through Rome. But their reaction was not despair. It was anger and a determination to take revenge. The Senate immediately ordered the construction of a new fleet, even larger than Ecnomus's, with 350 warships, its goal to sail to Africa, defeat the Carthaginian fleet, and rescue the 2,000 survivors besieged at Aspis. The fleet was successful. They routed a Carthaginian fleet that tried to intercept them and picked up the last of the expeditionary force. Mission accomplished. They were on their way back to Sicily, and that is when the real tragedy struck. The gods seemed to have decided that both sides had been too arrogant. As the massive fleet sailed along the southern coast of Sicily, near Camarina, experienced navigators warned the archons of an approaching storm and advised them to seek shelter. But the archons, perhaps flushed with victory, ignored the warning. The storm came with an indescribable fury. Roman ships, already top-heavy and unstable under the weight of Corvus, were overturned by the huge waves and smashed against the rocks. The shore was littered with broken timber. bodies and screams drowned out by the roar of the sea. When the storm cleared, the results were horrifying. Of the nearly 400 ships, ours, including captured ones, only 80 survived. It is estimated that as many as 100,000 men, legionnaires, sailors, rowers, lost their lives in a single day. It was the worst maritime disaster in history. In the space of a year, Rome had suffered its greatest naval victory, its most devastating land defeat, and its most terrifying disaster at sea. The great victory at Ecnomus and the humiliating defeat at Bagradas had both been wiped out by the relentless fury of the ocean. The war had been brought to a standstill, but the cost had been immeasurable. Both empires were exhausted, but the war was far from over. The disaster at Camarina was a blow to the heart of the Roman Republic. 100,000 lives lost to the sea in a single day. A fleet they had spent so much effort building had gone up in smoke. Any other nation, after such a terrible loss, would have sued for peace, accepted defeat, and withdrawn from the game. But this was Rome. And for the Romans, defeat was not an option. It was merely an excuse to become more stubborn. The Senate's response to the disaster perfectly demonstrated what the Greeks called furor Romanus, a mixture of courage, recklessness, and an iron will that bordered on irrational. They were undeterred. Instead of mourning, they ordered an even more prodigious shipbuilding effort. The shipyards once again sprang into action. According to historians, in just 3 short months, Rome had launched 20 new warships. It was a remarkable testament to their organization, their resources, and, above all, their unwavering determination. They had lost 1 fleet to the enemy, 1 to the gods, and now they were building a 3rd to challenge both. With this new fleet, in 254 BC the Romans returned to Sicily, determined to regain the initiative. Their target this time was Panormus, modern-day Palermo, Carthage's largest and most important city on the island, an administrative center and a strategic seaport. The attack was methodical and ruthless. The Roman fleet blockaded the seaport, while legions on land, equipped with huge siege engines, attacked the city walls from the mainland. After a fierce fight, a coastal defense tower collapsed, creating a breach. The legionnaires poured in, and Panormus, new town, quickly fell. The demoralized residents of the old town surrendered soon after. The capture of Panormus was a huge strategic victory. Rome now had a secure, deep water port in northwest Sicily, the perfect springboard for future operations. But luck seemed to be against them. In 253 BC, the new consuls, in an effort to demonstrate naval power, led their fleet on a series of raids along the African coast. But the voyage ended in disaster. On the return trip, another fierce storm hit, destroying another 150 ships. This was the last straw. 2 catastrophic maritime disasters in 3 years were too much, even for a resolute Rome. The loss of life and treasure was too great. The Republic's coffers were depleted. This time, the Senate had to accept the harsh reality. They could no longer continue the war at sea. The remaining fleet was disbanded, leaving only a handful of ships for transport and resupply. Rome decided to abandon the sea and return to its strength land warfare. They would strangle the remaining Carthaginian strongholds in Sicily with a war of attrition on land. This decision ushered in the most grueling and stalemate phase of the war. Over the next few years, the battlefields of Sicily became a war of trench warfare. The Romans, fresh from Caecilius's victory over war elephants at Panormus, had regained their confidence in facing these monsters. But they still acted cautiously, avoiding large battles on flat terrain and focusing on besieging cities. The war became a series of sieges, raids, and skirmishes. Both sides were exhausted, like 2 exhausted boxers, only able to embrace and exchange feeble punches. The focal point of this period was the siege of Lilybaeum, which began in 250 BC. Lilybaeum was Carthage's most important remaining fortress in Sicily, a heavily fortified seaport protected by high walls, a deep moat, and difficult to navigate marshes at the entrance to the port. Rome threw a huge force into the siege, determined to capture it at all costs. The siege of Lilybaeum was an epic of persistence and brutality. The Romans deployed their entire arsenal of siege weapons, mobile siege towers, catapults, and giant battering rams. Day after day they attacked the walls, while the Carthaginians, under the talented General Hamilcar, held out stubbornly. Every time the Romans breached a section of the wall, the Carthaginians built another behind it, dared to charge at night, aiming to burn out the Roman siege engines. The fighting was fierce underground, as both sides dug tunnels to collapse the other's fortifications. Rome's small fleet attempted to blockade the port, but skilled Carthaginian navigators, familiar with the dangerous shallows, repeatedly managed to slip through the siege, bringing reinforcements and supplies, and bringing news back home. The most famous of these blockade runners was a nobleman named Hannibal the Rhodian, who made entering and exiting Lilybaeum an art form. Mocking Roman incompetence, the siege dragged on seemingly endlessly. Then, in 249 BC, a new consul, Publius Claudius Pulcher, a member of the arrogant and temperamental Claudia family, came to take command. Tired of the deadlocked siege, he decided to make a bold move. He noticed that the Carthaginian fleet was anchored carelessly at the nearby port of Drepana, and he decided to attack by surprise. It was a good plan, but badly executed. Pulcher led his fleet to attack at dawn, hoping to catch the enemy while they were still sleeping. But before attacking, he performed a mandatory divination ritual, watching sacred chickens eat rice. The chickens refused to eat, an extremely bad omen. Pulcher, in a fit of anger and arrogance, shouted, "If they don't want to eat, let them drink," and threw the chickens into the sea. The blasphemy against the gods seemed to foreshadow disaster. The Carthaginian general at Drepana, Adherbal, was a capable and alert commander. He recognized the Roman attack in time and acted decisively. Instead of passively defending the harbor, he ordered his fleet to set sail immediately and confront the Romans at sea. Adherbal's action took Pulcher completely by surprise. The Roman fleet, which had been entering the harbor in formation, had to turn around in a hurry in the tight space. Chaos ensued. Ships collided, oars broke. When they finally turned, they were pinned against the shore by the Carthaginian fleet, which had been out at sea in perfect battle formation. The Battle of Drepana was a complete disaster. Caught between the Carthaginian fleet and the coast, with no room to maneuver, the Roman ships were systematically destroyed. Of the 123 ships, 93 were captured along with their crews. Pulcher escaped with a handful of ships. It was Rome's worst naval defeat in a single battle, and Carthage's only major naval victory of the entire war. Pulcher was recalled to Rome, tried, and severely punished for his incompetence and blasphemy. As if the disaster at Drepana were not enough, a Roman supply convoy was then destroyed by another Carthaginian fleet and another storm. Rome's resolve was finally broken. They had lost almost their entire fleet once again. The war at sea was truly over. Carthage had complete domination of the seas. The siege of Lilybaeum continued, but it became a symbol of the war's stalemate. The tide seemed to be turning in Carthage's favor. But at this moment, when Rome was at its weakest, Carthage failed to capitalize. The reason lay in its own nature. Carthage was a trading empire. The long war had drained its coffers. The merchant aristocracy, who held the real power, were wary of the cost of war. They believed that with Rome's abandonment of the sea, the main threat was gone. They cut naval budgets, grounded warships, and reduced military activity. They made a fatal mistake. They underestimated the endurance and will of their opponents. And it was in this deadlocked and wary scene that an extraordinary figure emerged on the scene, a man who would become a legend and the father of the greatest enemy in the history of Rome. His name was Hamilcar Barca. In 247 BC, Hamilcar was given command of the Carthaginian forces in Sicily. He had only a small army, mostly mercenaries, and almost no support from home. Faced with a much larger Roman army, Hamilcar knew that he could not win large-scale battles, so he did not play by their rules. He abandoned large-scale battles and launched a brilliant guerrilla campaign. First, he made a daring amphibious landing, seizing a mountain with an almost perfect natural defense called Herct, just off Panormus, the main Roman base. From this mountain fortress, Hamilcar made life hell for the Romans for 3 years. His force, agile and mobile, made constant lightning raids, attacked supply convoys, ambushed patrols, and then quickly retreated to his impregnable base. He was a painful thorn in the Romans' side, not strong enough to kill them, but strong enough to leave them bleeding. After 3 years at Herct, Hamilcar made another bold move. He moved his army to the foot of Mount Eryx, where a Roman garrison occupied the summit and its famous temple. Hamilcar captured the town at the foot of the mountain. Putting himself in an impossible position, he was besieging the Roman army on the summit, while he himself was surrounded from behind by another Roman army. For the next 2 years, a strange and brutal war was fought on the slopes of Mount Eryx. It was a war of raids and counter-raids, where personal courage and endurance were pushed to the limit. Hamilcar, isolated and without supplies, held back much larger Roman forces. He was more than a commander, he was the soul of the Carthaginian resistance. He shared the hardships of his men, fought alongside them, and won their absolute loyalty. He kept the flame of Carthaginian hope alive in Sicily by his own will and skill alone. But even genius cannot fight fate. Hamilcar may have won every skirmish, but he could not win a war of attrition. He was fighting alone, while his opponent, though exhausted, was a nation with virtually unlimited manpower and a will to never surrender. The war had dragged on for more than 2 decades. Both empires were at the limit of their endurance. Something had to happen, one last gamble, one final effort that would decide everything. In 242 BC, the Mediterranean was engulfed in a tense silence. The First Punic War had lasted 22 years, more than a generation. For most of the soldiers fighting, war was the only reality they had ever known. Both nations were exhausted to the core. Carthage, a trading empire, had seen its trade routes disrupted, its coffers drained by the cost of mercenaries, and agriculture in North Africa devastated by the invasion of Regulus. The morale of the ruling elite was broken. They just wanted peace so they could get back to making money. In Rome, the situation was no better. The loss of life was immeasurable. Hundreds of thousands of citizens, the backbone of the legions and the crews of the ships, lay forever at the bottom of the sea or in the fields of Sicily and Africa. Italian farms were abandoned for lack of men. The Republic's treasury was emptied. The war had become a giant meat grinder, devouring both men and treasure at a dizzying pace. On the battlefields of Sicily, a strange drama was unfolding. The military genius Hamilcar Barca, with his small army, was still dancing around the much larger Roman legions. He was an unstoppable specter, a master of guerrilla warfare who kept the Carthaginian banner flying in Sicily almost by his own sheer force. But he knew better than anyone that he was fighting a strategically lost war. He could win every engagement, but he could not win the war of attrition. For every Roman soldier who fell, 2 more were ready to replace him. For every mercenary he died, there was no one to replace him. He was fighting alone, abandoned by his government in Carthage. And it was in this moment of desperation and exhaustion that Rome did something that would come to define it. An act of collective will that stunned the world. The state treasury was bankrupt. There was no money left to build a new fleet. But Rome was not just a state, Rome was its citizens. The Senate made an unprecedented appeal. It asked the wealthiest citizens, the senators, the knights, to lend the Republic money from their own personal fortunes to finance one last gamble. The response was astonishing. Rome's richest families opened their coffers, not for profit, but for patriotism and determination to win. They staked their entire family fortunes on Rome's future. It was an act of cohesion and determination on the part of the Roman ruling class, a strength that Carthage, with its fragmented commercial elite, could never match. This sacrifice resulted in a new fleet of 200 quinquiremes. But these were not the same ships. The Romans had learned from their painful mistakes. These new ships were lighter, faster, and more maneuverable. They were likely built without the corvus, the weapon that had brought them early victories but contributed to their later disasters. After 20 years of war, Rome finally felt confident enough to take on Carthage on its own terms, a naval battle of pure skill and speed. The commander of this fleet was the consul Gaius Lutatius Catulus. He was no military genius, but he was a patient and pragmatic organizer. He understood that the best ships were useless without the best crews. Rather than rush into battle, Catulus spent months off the coast of Sicily tirelessly training his new soldiers and oarsmen. He transformed them from recruits into a well-coordinated, professional naval force ready for the decisive battle. Once his training was complete, he blockaded the last two Carthaginian strongholds, Lilybaeum and Drepana, completely cutting off Hamilcar Barca's supply lines. The trap was sprung. Carthage, faced with the prospect of starvation for Hamilcar and his valiant army, was forced to act. Hastily, they assembled a relief fleet under the command of a general named Hanno. But the fleet had two fatal weaknesses. First, it was filled with newly recruited oarsmen and sailors, lacking in experience and discipline. Second, and more importantly, it was overloaded with provisions and supplies for Hamilcar. The warships had become cumbersome and slow transports. Hanno's plan was sound. He would try to sneak up to Eryx under the cover of the wind, unload supplies for Hamilcar, then pick up Hamilcar's veteran mercenaries. With those seasoned warriors, he would be confident of turning back to confront the Roman fleet. But that plan depended on him avoiding Catulus. On March 10, 241 BC, Hanno's fleet approached the Aegates Islands, west of Sicily. A strong westerly wind was blowing, which was favorable for sailing to Hamilcar, but also created large waves and rough seas. Catulus, who was anchored nearby and had been wounded in a minor skirmish earlier, faced a difficult decision. Either engage the enemy in dangerous weather conditions, or stand still and risk letting Hanno slip through. He chose to fight. He ordered his fleet to sail. As the two fleets met, the difference was immediately apparent. The Roman ships, light and nimble, manned by well-trained crews, glided effortlessly through the waves. The Carthaginian ships, laden with cargo and manned by inexperienced oarsmen, struggled in the rough seas. The Battle of the Aegates Islands was not a one-sided contest. It was a massacre. The faster Roman ships easily closed in on and rammed the sluggish Carthaginian ships. The Roman marines, the elite of the legions, swarmed and seized the defenseless ships. Hanno's fleet disintegrated in panic. Within hours, 50 Carthaginian ships had been sunk and 70 captured, along with 10,000 sailors. The rest, thanks to a sudden change in the wind, escaped. News of the Aegates disaster returned to Carthage like a death sentence. They had no other fleet, no money to build a new one, and most importantly, no way to supply Hamilcar Barca. Their great general, who had never lost a battle, had been defeated not on the battlefield, but in a naval battle that was taking place miles away. The Carthaginian Senate, in a final act, sent a message to Hamilcar, giving him full authority. It was a way of abdicating responsibility. Hamilcar, the true soldier, faced reality. He knew that continuing to fight would only lead to the needless destruction of his loyal soldiers. With a heavy heart, Hamilcar Barca sent envoys to Catulus to negotiate peace. After 23 years, the longest and bloodiest war in history up to that point had come to an end. The terms of the treaty were harsh. Carthage had to completely abandon Sicily, which would become Rome's first province. They had to return all Roman prisoners without ransom, and they had to pay a huge indemnity of 200 talents of silver over 10 years, a sum enough to cripple their economy. Peace seemed to have come, but for Carthage, the worst nightmare was yet to come. As Hamilcar returned his mercenary army from Sicily to Africa to be demobilized, the bankrupt Carthaginian government made a terrible mistake. They tried to bargain and delay the payment of the soldiers who had fought for them. The response of the mercenaries, an army of tens of thousands of brutal warriors from around the world, was a fierce uprising. This war, known as the Mercenary War, or War Without Pact, was even more brutal than the war with Rome. The mercenaries laid siege to Carthage itself, and the empire teetered on the brink of collapse. In desperation, Carthage turned to the general it had abandoned, Hamilcar Barca. And Hamilcar, once again, demonstrated his genius. With a small army of citizens and loyalists, he conducted a brilliant campaign, using cunning and masterful tactics to divide and destroy the much larger rebel army. After 3 years of brutal warfare, he saved Carthage from destruction. But while Carthage was busy fighting for its survival, Rome struck the final blow, a blow of cunning and opportunity. Taking advantage of Carthage's moment of weakness, and using the pretext of a revolt by mercenaries in Sardinia to cause unrest, Rome sent troops to occupy both Sardinia and Corsica. When Carthage protested, Rome threatened war again, and forced Carthage to cede the 2 islands and pay a further fine of 200 talents. This was the final insult. For Hamilcar Barca, this act made one thing clear: Rome was not an honorable opponent. It was a greedy wolf that could never be satisfied. There could never be true peace between Rome and Carthage. There could only be domination or destruction. After pacifying Africa, Hamilcar, now the most powerful figure in Carthage, began to execute his long-term plan of revenge. He knew that Carthage needed a new base, a new source of resources to challenge Rome once more, and he found it in Spain, a land rich in silver, iron, and fierce warriors. In 237 BC, as he prepared for the great expedition to Spain that would create a new empire for the Barca family, he performed a ritual sacrifice to the gods. His eldest son, a 9-year-old boy named Hannibal, asked to go with him. Hamilcar looked into his son's eyes. He led the boy to the altar. He asked Hannibal to place his hand on the offering and swear an oath. Not an oath of loyalty to Carthage, not an oath of personal glory, but an oath forged from bitterness, humiliation, and an unquenchable desire for vengeance. He asked Hannibal to swear that, as long as he breathed, he would never be a friend of the Romans. The boy Hannibal swore. The First Punic War was over. Rome had won. They had Sicily, Sardinia, Corsica, an unconquerable fleet, and the status of undisputed superpower. They had won everything. But in the arrogance and cruelty of their victory, they had planted a seed. That seed, watered by the oath of a child, would grow into the most terrible nightmare the Republic had ever faced. The first battle of the giants was over, but it was only the prelude to a conflict far greater and more terrible, a conflict that would be led by the very boy who had sworn the oath at the altar that day.